The characters talk too much.
Do games even need stories?
Localization's pretty expensive.
But they just click through everything anyway.
If you've heard things like this from your players or colleagues, you might understand the difficulties in building a narrative design team. So today we are going to give you a case study, an honest, candid approach to how we are doing things at PikPok, our wins and learnings, our challenges and struggles, as we have embarked on having a full narrative design team. So let's start with who a narrative designer is. Try to keep this short since there are a lot of familiar faces in the crowd. I'm Rick Stem. I'm design manager, which also includes me being narrative director at PikPok. I've done a lot of things. I was an instructional designer for many years, building up the e-learning program at Epic, the electronic medical records company. I've worked in educational games and serious games. I've worked in education, teaching game design. I've been a consultant, a freelancer, a playwright with many produced shows, a weird transmedia interactive artist, a salesman, and more. And I bring all that to PikPok. And also, I'm just gonna do this because I know you guys. Today's my 40th birthday, so thanks for coming to this party. Unlike most Kiwis, the best birthday present you can get me is a public speaking engagement and a bunch of attention.
Hi, I'm Mike Boys. I'm a senior narrative designer at PikPok. And I started out in the industry as a videographer, making trailers and promos and stuff like that. And then I worked as a 3D artist for a few years before slowly doing more script writing and cutscene directing, which has always been a passion of mine. And it's something I do full time now.
I'm Stacey Wellington. I'm an experienced narrative designer at PikPok, which is the intermediate level for other people. And yeah, before starting at PikPok, I was a narrative designer at A44 Games. And before that, I worked in libraries and I studied classics. I have an MA in classics. And thanks for the woo to libraries. Libraries are awesome. But yeah, that's me.
I'm Sarah Damond, and I am the narrative designer at PikPok. Before getting here, I spent about 10 years in indie writing for LARPs across New Zealand. And before that, I got a degree in script writing because I knew I wanted to work on video games. I just didn't know how to get there.
My clicker seems to have broken, by the way, FYI, backstage. That's okay. I'm sure we'll get that working quickly. The good news is twofold. One, the slides don't really matter. They are just here for a little structure. And two, this is not a best practices talk. This is, again, a candid discussion about the wins and learnings we've had, but also the struggles and challenges in building a team. So that's what we're going to go into. So again, if the slides don't appear, no problem. The talk's going to look like this. We're going to go through chronologically the flow of PikPok, so how we started and how we evolved and where we got to today, our hopes for the future and where we're going to learn and grow, and then there's going to be plenty of time for Q&A. In fact, we have specifically planned the talk around that, so while I understand like bellowing into the echoing void that is this giant auditorium is not the friendliest way to do Q&A, that is a big part of the talk, so please, when we get there, think of your questions, go up to the mics, and bring it forward. So, in the past, to start, to bring us back, we didn't have any narrative design at PikPok, but we still were doing a little bit of occasional narrative in our game. So we would work either with no narrative or with contractors. And there were pluses and minuses to that. And Mike, you were there during those days, so you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, in the early days, the games that the studio made were a little more light on narrative content. One of them was about a boulder that rolls down a hill and squashes people, which is a great story and one of my favorite games. But over the years, we started to include more characters and tutorial steps and dialogue and things, so we needed people to actually sit down and type that stuff. And we used contractors every once in a while, which worked out, but also had some challenges in this, because working remotely, you don't know the game as intimately as someone on the team, and you can also get some delays in communication as well. So they're not the dark times, but we soon realized that we need people in-house to actually oversee the narrative within our games.
Yeah, a contract writer is a great path, and we have some good ones in the house today. And there are some advantages to getting them too. Good, I'm clicking through and getting us back up to speed. You know, with a contract writer, you're going to get a subject matter expert who's really good at what they do and are laser focused on that job. But what you don't have is someone embedded in the team and there for that rapid iteration. especially with a game that's already live. Things change, and if you don't have those great communication pathways set up, it's sometimes hard to keep track of that. And so we found that as we did more of this agile and iterative design, we really needed people on the teams getting involved in narrative design. So people stepped up, but those people had other roles on the team, and then they would sub in as a writer or narrative designer as needed. In fact, Mike, you originated that role.
Yeah, that's right, Rick. People in the team would jump in and kind of like write stuff when the need arose, which is good because, like you said, that they would know the project very well. Like Ryan Langley would also do a lot of that. But you also find that because you're doing other roles inside the game, there'd be like systems to design or UVs to unwrap and things like that. So it would be hard to focus just on the narrative. And because of that, sometimes the story of a game would be sort of an afterthought or applied after the fact. So we decided that we actually need some people who were specialized.
Yeah, because the advantage of having someone on the team doing it part-time is, again, they're embedded in the team. They have their existing expertise in their discipline. They know how the project team and the game flow works. But again, they're balancing those split priorities. So there's nobody to advocate for the discipline of narrative design. So it's not just that the writing gets less priority. It's that there's no one there to really understand what the whole discipline means. And that was one of the things that really pushed us to grow the entire team. So we'll talk a little bit about our hiring process and how we built the team and why we built the team, and then we'll talk more about our current structure. So I'm going to start off right away with the best thing that I did, and that I wish I would have done sooner and more of, is hire 2 people instead of 1. We were going to hire 1 narrative designer, but I quickly, and Andy, our chief design officer, helped me quickly realize that we were probably going to need more, so double hiring up front was great. And I wish I would have even done more and sooner, so we didn't throw people in trial by fire, but we'll talk more about that later. So when we were hiring, what happened is I'm still kind of pulling double duty as design manager and narrative director, but we did move Mike over to full-time narrative design, recognized we needed to build the team, and so started hiring. So yeah, let's just talk about some of the things that we were looking for when we were hiring, like what we thought would make an appropriate team member and narrative designer.
Yeah, when we were hiring people, we were looking for certain skills, obviously being able to write good dialogue and prose and all that stuff well is important, but those kinds of skills are sort of expected. We were really, when we were looking at candidates, thinking about people who collaborate well.
That's probably the most important thing. Every day I will take like a mediocre narrative designer who's a great collaborator versus a great writer who is a mediocre collaborator.
Yeah, so we weren't looking for people who would just like go away and write in a cabin somewhere and then deliver it like months later. You really need to be interacting with the team quite a lot and getting a handle on what the game is. And yeah, people who could write in different tones were important as well.
Yep, that was a big part of our writing test. We ended up putting together this, and you guys might talk about this 7-part writing test with all these different challenges across different tones and technical considerations. Because one of the other key things we needed were someone who wasn't just a game writer, but a narrative designer, and understood that difference. And for better or for worse, at PikPok, we do both roles. I know some bigger companies separate narrative design and game writing, or some only have need of one or the other, but we pull double duty. So we needed people who understood how to tell game story through, emergent narratives, who understood how systems and mechanics and interactions could create storytelling experiences, who could, again, collaborate with the artists and the UI and UX people to make sure that that flow and background feel was building the fantasy. So there were a lot of questions and tests about that. So looking for collaborators, looking for narrative designers who, again, understood that storytelling without words. Like if you saw my talk last year, everything but the writing, that kind of stuff. And what else?
Yeah, all that stuff. And, and passion as well. Passion comes across. That's always it's pretty hard to fake that, right?
I think that's a good segue, right? One of the reasons Sarah and Stacy are on the stage now is because they showed that devotion and showed that passion. So why don't y'all talk about what was it like from the other side, applying to it? What made you want to apply to PikPok? What made you want to be a narrative designer? How did you, what skills did you think you have that made you good candidates?
This is like the actual interview right now. This is crazy.
Well, I'd always known I wanted to work as a narrative designer. I'd heard that PikPok was a fantastic company to work for, and I'd checked the careers page in the past. It's like, they don't need any narrative designers. And I'd even begun looking at Australia or further afield to find that kind of career. And then suddenly, like at midnight, I saw a PikPok hiring narrative designers thing. I was like, well, I've got to get in on this right now. So I did, in this fever dream, I spent 3 hours writing the most enthusiastic cover letter of my life. I made myself sound like the best person in the universe, and I sent it off by about 3 a.m. And I was the first applicant, which was a strong start for me.
Yeah, and that helped because then every other cover letter got compared to that. And so if you're the kind of person that's like, CV attached, and that's your entire cover letter, then we go, do you really excited about this job? Especially when we have someone who just gave us their life story, and we know they're into it.
Do you remember your opening line?
Do you?
I'm sure Rick does.
I remember my opening line to Andy, which I like to think, thankfully he understands this, where I was like, I am here to tell you why I'm the best fit for this position and why you can't live without me. And, that's a risky thing. A lot of Kiwis would be like, garbage.
And you got hired despite that. That's great.
Thankfully, Andy knew we needed a room for a communicator, a kind of a vision holder, an enthusiastic person. So I was thankful for that.
Yeah, luckily I didn't know what I was up against because I just did the generic, I am eager to apply for this position because, I was pretty keen to work in a team. So that was something that appealed to me at A44. Shout out to Daniel Bider, who I work with as a narrative designer. So I already knew how good it was having other people to bounce ideas off. I was kind of thinking about the contract route versus being in-house, and I think it's not just a benefit for the product to have an in-house team, but it's also beneficial being the team member because, you can have that feedback and support and just that motivation to keep yourself going. It's really helpful to just have peers around you. So that was something that appealed to me. And then also, you've also already talked a little bit, Rick, about your approach to narrative design and it being more than just the writing, and that was something that really resonated with what I wanted to do and sort of my approach. And that you want to make the most of the medium of games, so you don't want to just have text that gets stuck in at the end or a story that's just papering over the things that don't make sense. You really want to be integrated and trying to create an experience and using narrative to do that. So I really appreciated that you guys already had a vision for how you wanted narrative design to work at PikPok, and that appealed to me.
I agree with that. In my history in LARP, I did a lot of collaborative writing. I created a lot of physical games with other people, and so I didn't want to work alone. So the thought of being in a writer's room with other writers, with really enthusiastic, passionate people was just a dream come true.
So part of the big parts of the process were the test, which again I said were like 7 or 8 different prompts encompassing a huge variety of tones in narrative writing. And also collaborative interviews. So for example, interviewing with our art director to talk about how narrative and art direction works together, or with our other design manager whose focus was optimization and monetization and how can narrative support that. So any thoughts you guys have remembering those interviews with the kind of other managers of other disciplines or the writing test?
Yeah, well, I remember that the other design manager felt like he was the only one who was really testing me. Like everyone else, kind of tries to help you along and kind of ask the questions in a soft way. And he was like, but for this type of game, what would narrative contribute? And so it kind of, it was fine in my answers. We talked about it and it worked out well. But having that experience and ability to interact with other disciplines that might have different perspectives, and I think that was kind of something that was really valuable for you guys to bring into the interview process, because it's something that you have to do a lot in the job of having people might have different priorities, that he might not be sold that the type of game he had in mind would need that much narrative. And so he was really testing whether I was going to say, well, I want to write a 300,000 word script and I want to put that into this match 3 game. And so, it was a good thing to have those sort of experiences. And but also that he was open to my answers and stuff. So
I really enjoyed those conversations because on one hand, I had someone asking me, what about the data? What about customer retention? And I was like, I used to work at Nielsen. I can talk about data for hours. But on the other hand, when I was being asked about how do you collaborate with artists, I could give real world examples. I once had to give someone instructions on how to create giant demonic claws with very, very sparse instructions because that person was going to be a player in the same game where the claws would come out. So those were fun. I enjoyed those conversations a lot. The whole interview process was such a breeze.
Well, I think if you enjoy it, right, and if you're excited about it, that comes across. And that's something Mike and I noticed in some of the other candidates, right? So maybe some thoughts on, obviously without throwing anyone under the bus, like what were some things that maybe made someone not stand out or make you wonder if they wouldn't be a good fit for our team?
Yeah, people who didn't have a lot of experience working in a group at all, like, Sarah's LARPing experience was a big plus. It showed that she can collaborate well and, be a big part of a team, things like that. But someone who didn't stand out is pretty hard to think about off the top of my head.
We don't want to insult anyone, but there was that lack of enthusiasm, right?
Yeah,
there were all those
people who were just like, oh, okay,
Yeah, again, here's my CV, no cover letter, or a couple people were like, oh, so why do you want to move from your field into narrative design, or why do you want to work for PikPok? And they're like, I'm not sure that I do really. I just figured I'd try it out.
Yeah, that's not a great opener.
Yeah, and that's okay. It's good that they're being honest, but it's also we're going to weigh that against someone who's like, I know that I want to do this, and I know why I want to do this, and I'm excited to contribute. So that was our process. And again, if you have more questions about what you look for in hiring or how to get hired, certainly bring those to Q&A. So got us to our current structure. So I'm going to talk us through briefly how we have things, and then we'll also go into some of our wins and learnings and some of our challenges and struggles. So briefly, what we have is at my level, I try not to do narrative design. I try to advocate for the discipline and occasionally set the vision, sort of the high-level creative vision of a game and where I can and have that off. But mostly I'm there to mentor and manage and hopefully ease the strain on the game design team, the narrative team, and learn how to work better with other disciplines. And then for our designers, each of them are currently assigned to one project. And a very recent learning is to really try and focus in on that. Because I did have you guys balancing projects, and it was difficult. Even when it looked like a project didn't need someone full-time because there wasn't that much writing or narrative design, actually it's still splitting your mental focus. It's still taking away that time to advocate for your discipline, to put those pipelines in place, to just build relationships. So going forward, trying to keep you guys focused each on one project, trying to set more boundaries. So if someone does want narrative design, great, but we can say, well, here's the lead up time we need and things like that. So again, currently we have one person assigned to each game. The games we have going that don't have a narrative designer are either very small, where they can just kind of consult with me and I can give them a little direction. A designer, someone who's keen on writing, can throw through things at me and I can review it. Or we're trying to tell them they gotta wait. And that is helping. But again, we found some things that work and we found some things that we're still struggling with. So let's start by, if you guys could each think of something that has gone well. What's a win in terms of having a narrative design team? What do you think you've been able to get across, improve in our processes, successfully implement in a game since we formed our team?
I feel like we do peer reviews with each other twice a week where we bring something we're working on, might be a script or a story outline, and we'll discuss it as a group. And I find that really valuable because there might be, sometimes when you look at things so closely and you're in the weeds of it, it's good to just get some other opinions. And it's great being able to talk to people who have been through similar processes.
Yeah, definitely working together is a huge benefit. And also kind of what Rick was saying about having each of us focus on a project, we've found that to be really helpful and kind of having that really close collaboration with different disciplines. There's definitely been lots of really cool wins for me, like developing a character and then having the concept team make character art for it is just awesome. And so, yeah, being integrated with the teams has been pretty successful, I think, and like really allowing us to contribute to that cohesive experience with the story at the base. So, yeah.
Yeah, one thing I want to clarify that's a part of our current structure, and we haven't quite cracked this nut yet, is sometimes our narrative designers are fully embedded in the teams. You guys sit with the team, you go to all their stand-ups and all that. And sometimes you sit in the narrative design area because the team, the game is a little smaller, it doesn't need you as much as that moment. There are advantages and disadvantages to each. In general, if it's a heavy narrative project, it helps to have them embedded in the team. But then that also makes it harder for us to do things like peer review and support each other. And again, get agreed on what our goals and our pipelines are. We just have less time when we're not sitting together. So again, don't have any easy answers on that. It's something we're still trying to balance and figure out, but I think it's worthwhile calling out that both success and difficulty. Sarah, your wins.
So for me, what I've found to be really successful is how enthusiastic so many people are about narrative. I mean, in game design companies, a lot of people are nerds just in general, so in their own hobbies, in their own time. People really enjoy things that are narratively focused. And so talking about narrative at work can lead to some really great discussions and making great friendships with people. And when you make good friendships with other people in the company, you're getting more people advocating for what you do, even when you're not in the room.
Yeah, that's makes me think of something that's both kind of a win and a struggle, and I think game designers especially will understand this, is that everybody's a storyteller, right? Like, everybody understands stories, and everybody writes. You know, right? You send emails, I write every day. And so, on the one hand, that's great, because everybody sort of intrinsically understands what you do. And on the other hand, that can be difficult, because everybody has feedback on what you do without necessarily fully understanding what you do. So it makes this interesting thing where it's sort of easier to advocate, but sometimes harder to draw some lines. And I'll use that to segue to our next bit. Like, if you guys could think of one or two things that we're still struggling with, that we haven't quite figured out yet, you know, that's still been a little rough.
Struggle might be a bit strong, but when you're sort of presenting a script to the team or going over it, like, you shouldn't always assume that everyone understands the tone of certain moments. So yeah, sometimes you have to kind of like keep an eye on how things are going, and yeah, it's just yeah, you just have to be quite proactive in that, and kind of it's best if you keep going, you get involved in that process as much as you can.
Yeah, that's why we talk about narrative designers as good people for helping with the vision, something that we talked about in the workshop on Wednesday, if you were at that, is if people understand what the game is and isn't who the audience is and isn't what the experience you're going for, that makes it much easier to set that on. But that's also much easier to do if there's a narrative designer involved from the beginning. And if you don't have that, much harder to add partway through.
Yeah, I guess the most difficult things are around connecting with other disciplines, and especially in terms of like workflows and timelines and stuff like that. Like the narrative pipelines talk was amazing earlier today. That sheet of all the different times we interact with different disciplines throughout the process of creating a story, it really can be quite complex. And so us figuring out our internal pipelines and then how to connect with what other teams are doing, and then communication as well around that. And then, just people with different skill sets or different focuses having different priorities, and then trying to navigate that as well. Kind of similar to what Mike was talking about with tone, but also just in terms of that they would see their area of discipline, they understand what's important to hit on that, and that we might have a slightly different focus. And so trying to be able to communicate and frame the narrative as contributing to the whole experience of the game, and not being something that necessarily detracts from another priority or another focus, but as something that is going towards the experience, and that we're going to try and hook up and connect with what they're also trying to do, and then push both of those things forward in the same direction. But it's something that probably a lot of disciplines find difficult, but it can be very difficult for narrative because it's so invisible, the story and narrative, and if it's not the text, if it's the sort of ideas around it, it can be quite hard to communicate that. So.
And one clarification, not that this is easy, but the difficult part isn't always figuring out the pipeline. Like, if you have experience, you kind of know what it is. The harder part is implementing it. For example, if you have a game, again, our team is new. And so if we have a game in development that hasn't had a narrative designer and we add one, at that point, it's kind of too late. They're already far along. So either the narrative designer is going to struggle to catch up, or we're going to have to pause the project and all the financial ramifications that has to put that pipeline into place. And again, there's no easy answer. We talk about what our options are. We talk about what we can learn on the new project. So I guess that's another kind of overall learning, right? Is because we only recently have a team, but we've been making games for 25 years, integrating this new formal discipline is not, super smooth.
For me, a challenge I've found is a thing around communication and terminology. Because for example, in Agile, there are things called stories. So as a narrative designer, I have to use a different word to refer to what I'm talking about. And even narrative designer means different things to different people. Some people assume I'm just there to write the words. Other people assume I'm there for other things. And sometimes you can be talking about the same thing as someone else and using completely different terms. And it can take a while of just like sitting down and workshopping through that to understand you're on the same page, or maybe not. But finding that common ground and understanding where people are coming from can sometimes take a while, and also vice versa.
It's so funny. I've had that Jira story situation so many times when someone's like, this story, and I'm like, what? That's not a story
This
in
is
this
a
game.
daily struggle for all of us.
But-
Well, even story in just a narrative context, right? Sometimes when people say story, they just mean the words. And sometimes when people say story, they mean everything that contributes to the fantasy of the player experience. And sometimes people use narrative for that term, and sometimes people use lore or fantasy to that term. And, we haven't necessarily had the time to like make a glossary of what the fuck we mean by these things and sell it out to the company, but that would be useful. And related, I think one of the big struggles I've seen, kind of from the high end is how narrative, like other shared teams, integrate with Agile. So we are an Agile company. We work in sprints and have Scrum teams and a PO. And creative work doesn't always fit nicely into that. And so it's often difficult when they go, all right, well, what can you do this sprint? And we're just like, it doesn't work like that. Sometimes it does. If there's a new feature and it needs some flavor text and some instructional text and some meeting with the UX to make sure it's consistent, great. But if you're like, we are implementing an entirely new story, like it takes months to come up with the character bios and the art and the story outline and all the character arcs and the plot flow and to, get it all in game and test it, like that can't be done sprint to sprint. You don't write chapter 1 in isolation and then chapter 2. You got to plan the whole thing. And so again, just letting people know, like, we have to get our roadmaps out 3 months in advance at least or more if we're going to do any of this. And there's no way to skip pre-production and narrative's involvement in that. So as we improve our Agile, one, I guess also win we've had is from the top, Tyron, our COO, and Nick, one of our POs, to their credit, they have made that an area of focus of going, we have to figure out how teams who aren't necessarily in the core team or who don't work neatly in that fit into this.
Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily factor in how long it takes you to go over what you're writing several times and develop the outlines and things like that. You might get that assumption where it's like, oh, surely you just like type it out, right? Like, how fast can you type?
Yeah, thinking time is usually not factored into work time, and thinking time is the most important part of what we do. Like, how many minutes do you spend actually writing? It's mostly thinking about writing. Thank you. Yeah, we have some people who understand in the audience. So nicely, perfectly, as if I planned it, that actually takes us about halfway through our talk, which was my evil plan all along. So I have plenty of talking points to keep us going, but even better would be if we had some Q&A. So if you guys have questions, we would love to have you by the microphones. Again, this is a candid discussion. I think the best learning will come for that. So please ask us questions and keep the conversation going.
Hey team, I don't have a question for anyone in particular, but I was thinking, sometimes jobs, work can get stressful and other things come up and affect your mood and what your thought processes are. Do you have any times when that affects the writing negatively, or is it a good thing?
Oh, nice juicy question. What do you guys think?
Oh, yeah. Do you have to suffer to make great art? Am I phrasing that right?
Do not suffer for your art.
Yeah, that would be a big no. We've been working at home, so making sure I'm getting exercise and going outside every once in a while. And yeah, you're not going to do your best work if you're stressed out of your mind. I think it just interferes with your clarity, really.
Yeah, I think that especially like Rick said, that you're doing lots of thinking work. So if your brain's not in a space to do the thinking, then that's not a good thing. Although I do think that having life experience can be helpful. Like earlier in the year, my flat got burgled. And as I was walking home, I was like, well, at least I'm a writer. So this is good, material I can use. There would be no silver lining to this if I did not have this job. So yep. I don't know. It's good
you
to
can all look forward to the flat burglary game. It will be at least.
I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but it's one of those things where you have to think and understand about life to write things, but at the same time you need to have a healthy mental space to do it. So
yeah, I had some really weird health issues this year. I needed to get my gallbladder taken out, and it's really, really hard to be creative when you are on heavy pain meds. So you just need to take care of yourself first and foremost. You need to make sure that you've got a team of people around you who understand that you need to take care of yourself. Writing through suffering, just if you enjoy that process, then if that's what works for you, then I won't knock it, but please put yourself first every time, because you will get your best work when you're at your best.
And that's really, and Mark, who asked the question, will know this. It's our job as managers, right? Like that's the first thing we need to do is take care of our people, and then I think looking over the craft and stuff comes much later. And thankfully, my background as an educator, I taught at what we call creative youth development, which is this after-school arts program where basically you use art as a way to develop students. So the product is art. They do gallery shows, or I had them, making video games for PAX and other conventions, which was cool. But really, the goal was to help them find their voice, help them find confidence, help them make meaningful relationships. And like what made them do well was, when they were happy and healthy. And then everything else flowed from that.
One more thing on that. I am very open with my team that I do have some mental health issues and I take medication and stuff. So I am always very, very comfortable occasionally telling my team like, hey, mentally I feel awful today. I'm going to take a couple of hours, just like be in the sun and take care of myself. And they've always been like, sweet, see you in a few hours then.
We have someone at the mic and then a question. You can shout them up front and I'll repeat them as well, but at the mic first.
Oh, left my chair for no reason. Whoops. Bringing all this together, could you describe any tools or processes where you can get the whole narrative department pulling together in one stylistic direction, or is it just leave everyone to go off in their own directions?
What a great question.
Yeah, we actually went through that recently. So I'll talk about how we set it up, and you guys can talk about what worked and what didn't. So we have a game, it's in soft launch now, I can mention it, Viking Gods Clicker. It's a little idle clicker and character collection game. And for the most part, that worked well, though we ran into a couple stumbles. What worked well is that was one of the few projects where narrative and art direction and market research were there up front. The very first thing we did is have games user research go, here's everything we've learned from our other clicker games, and have market research go, here's everything we know about our audience. And then it was basically just me and our art director going, cool, all right, based on that, based on the goals of this project, the time frame we have, our knowledge of our audience, what's the tone and story and characters? And so we worked together hand in hand to put together an IP Bible, and that was great because then we knew what the voice was and what the reference titles were and what the experience pillars were and where, what was in tone and what was out of tone, and like that really worked well. And then from there, I think I did some very loose writing. I kind of came up with who the main characters were and what loosely the main plot was. As a little dovetail into narrative design, that's one of my favorite examples of mechanics doing plot. So the idea is that like in these clicker games, we have a prestige mechanic, which is like when you reset everything, you destroy all your progress and start over, but then you get a huge bonus that helps you move faster. But in some games, people don't want to destroy everything they've done or don't understand why that's a benefit, but that's the best way to progress. So we had this clear problem of gameplay. And so I went, cool, all right, well, we've got this, Norse mythology game, so clearly Ragnarok is going to be that mechanic. So if the whole story is about Ragnarok and why Ragnarok keeps happening instead of only happening once, one, that's kind of an interesting mystery and a weird take on Norse mythology, but two, it's driving them to that mechanic that they don't understand. So that was really neat. So anyway, we had our IP guide, we had our kind of loose outline and characters, and then from there I handed it off to Mike.
My job was to try to figure out what Rick was on about, and I'm just kidding. It was a
great IP guide.
Very clear IP guide, beautiful, like perfectly laid out, very easy to understand. So I took that. So in a sense, Rick's established like the characters, right? Like who's the main character in this game? What do they want? What stands in their way? And that's what you're thinking about as you're developing an outline, which was the next step. Where for those who don't know, the outline is it's almost like the story in bullet points, the simplest way of being able to read over it and get a high-level view of it. So I worked on that for a little bit, and I think I made some changes, and Rick wasn't furious, so it was good.
No, it was great. You did, you really took those key points and turned it into a whole outline. And we also knew there were 9 realms, and so they're going to be these 9 levels, and you flew it through that, and you had the kind of main antagonists at each point, and the main plot beats at each point with the main characters, and then you had written the first realm or two, and then that's when we handed it off to Sarah.
So from there, I did a lot of character bios for the collectible champions, and I also wrote up a reference document for the 9 realms and what plot beats and characters would be collected in each realm so that everyone across the team had a solid understanding of what each of those places meant, what they would look like, what they felt like, what they would sound like, so that anyone working on those things could refer to that document as a single source of truth. And then from there, I was working on the script from realms 1 through 5 for our soft launch. It's currently in soft launch across New Zealand, Australia, and several other countries. But from there, we handed on to Stacey, who is handling things for hard launch, which is TBD.
Yeah, and we had a couple of bumps that I think are worth talking about.
Yeah, so I guess by the stage I got onto it, which was only a few weeks ago, so it had gone obviously through a few different hands, and then obviously a few different changes had happened. So there was like
It's like the same story filtered through different minds, and it's changing along the way. And like, yeah, I hadn't read it for a while. I mean, it's like it's evolved, but in a lot of good ways. But yeah,
it's one of those things where it's a benefit, but it's also can be quite challenging. So having those different perspectives made it quite robust that different people with different strengths and different perspectives had all touched it.
And remember, we had that IP guide, and I was occasionally checking tone. So that's how we got the consistency, is that IP Bible and occasionally going, hey, actually, you know, we need to adjust these things to keep
it didn't change genres every time.
Yeah. And I think that was clear from what was handed to me, that the core of the game was still really strong, and the characters were strong, and the general plot was strong, but there'd also been some kind of like mechanical reasons for changes, like that early on there was a bit too much going on, so we had to bump a character who was a quite important character, and then so the whole outline was thrown up in the air, and then so some of the work that I did was taking the outline and then sort of reworking it a little bit, and then kind of retroactively looking at previous realms and seeing if anything needed to change there to sort of preload the new way that we were slightly trying to pivot it. And then there was also another character who was meant to be in this release that the art hadn't been made, so then we had to, you know, so it's one of those things where these pipelines are really helpful, but then I feel like sometimes stuff goes wrong, and that's pretty common.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to like write out an outline or a plan, but then once it hits production, there's all kinds of things that's going to happen.
Yeah, and you just have to, I guess, be adaptable, and then be able to zoom out to look at the whole picture, and while also.
Well, and that was our mistake, right? Is there were so many little changes as it got passed on that we didn't realize that the, you know, a combination of those little changes had actually changed the outline, but no one had built in time to relook at the outline and change it, and so we had to build in time. And we're there now, but you had a couple stressful weeks until we built in that time.
So what have we learned?
Yeah, IP guides are good, getting narrative involved in market research early are good, making your handoffs clear, making sure all of your documentation is in place before you hand it off and not just assuming it is.
And I think also to go back and update your fundamental documentation when changes happen. So it's like that change where there was that issue where there was too much at the beginning, it was the right call to push some of that stuff back. But then just being really aware that, about the flow-on effects of that, and just because things were handing off between people, some things can fall through the cracks.
Right, we could talk about this forever, so I'm going to move to the next question. It's great stuff. So I got to moderate sometimes too, and I talk too much. I'm sorry. Mike's first, and then down in the row. So we'll get the two mics, and then two people in the front row. I can't remember which one of you guys was first. Sorry.
I'm not sure. They can go first.
I'm just. Sorry, can you hear me?
No, I think either our sound guy has to activate it, or you have to be a little more directional with the mic.
That's okay. I can.
Say it, and I'll repeat it in the mic for recording purposes.
I'm just wondering, as people who have worked with or worn a few different hats in the creative industries, what is it kind of like transferring from something else to, not specifically narrative, but in this case narrative, or even studying in a different kind of creative area and then finding yourself in a new area and perhaps even wanting to do both? Kind of what are the complications with that, or things that you've found that are difficult or just interesting about that?
Cool. Pretty clear, but in case you didn't hear, the complications and opportunities of working in multiple different creative fields, wearing different hats, moving from one kind of writing or creativity to another. What have y'all found?
Yeah, what's it like? It's pretty awesome. Because the stuff you do is very varied and it's all creative. So, you know, I still like 3D modeling, and, you know, I still like editing videos and stuff like that. So I've been really fortunate to be able to do lots of different things within the company. Trying to do multiple things simultaneously is a bit of a bit tricky, however. Like I was saying before, it can kind of give you, if it's on the same project, it can give you insight into the project. Like, I would work on Into the Dead, and for a while there I was also making the promotional materials for it, so I kind of know the assets that have been created and know what to call out within the trailers. So that was quite helpful. But yeah, at a certain point, it's helpful if you do have one thing to focus on, and then you can really push things forward on that one kind of skill.
Anyone else?
I'm just going to trail off.
Don't look at me, I always wanted to be here.
Well, Sarah did LARP, so I'm sure you have some great LARP stories. But yeah, I haven't really done too many different creative fields within games. I think it's always a strength to have a different background, though. Like, my background's a little bit different. Studying classics, not too many practical applications for that. But then it gives you a really, a different way of thinking, which is quite valuable. So I think it's good to have a diverse background.
Yeah.
Actually, I do have a side story to that, in that I didn't want to learn many other creative fields. I didn't want to learn game design. I probably should have. I didn't want to learn art. I didn't want to create my own indie games doing everything by myself, because I knew that would absolutely exhaust me. That's why I got into LARP and working on teams with other people who could wear those other hats. And that's, again, why I wanted to work in a team at a company where everyone has their own hats.
Yeah. All else being equal, and I really respect Andy, our Chief Design Officer, for this, if you have the minimum skills, those tangential things just make you more valuable. You just bring perspectives that we don't have otherwise, and it adds to the tasty, tasty goulash of our skill and culture set. Next mic question.
Hey, so I was just wondering if there are different perspectives in the writing team. How do you validate an idea? Is it better to ask someone who is involved in the production, or do you go to an unbiased party who knows nothing and is just put on the spot, what do you think of this?
So the short version, but we can talk more about this, is what we try to do is whoever is the narrative designer for that game has final say. So in peer review, we'll all give them the idea, but if Mike is the one writing for Into the Dead, we're going to give him our feedback, but we trust Mike to make the final decision on what goes in because he is the narrative designer on that title. So there's a lot of trust that way, and that's why it helps to focus people on one project. That said, there are occasional things that might trump it. If the CEO or sometimes if Mia's narrative director is like, that really doesn't work for these reasons. It goes against this gameplay thing and it causes these tech issues, and I've seen the market research of our audience. I don't think this is going to work. Please change it. But even then, I try to go, and it's up to you to figure out how to change it. I just, you need to hit this goal. So that's, we have occasional higher level sources, but mostly we trust who's on the project. Anything else you guys want to add to that when we've had that?
I think that pretty much sums it up, yeah. As long as someone does have the final call, that's very helpful.
Yeah, I think even with the Viking Gods thing, I had an example of this where early on Mike had it, and we had a peer review session where we were throwing around ideas, and then I gave you all of these ideas, and then when I came back,
and
then when I came back to do the outline more recently, I was like, man, these really aren't working that great. And we talked about it, and you were like, you told me to do that. And it's one of those things where the person on the project really does understand it the best, and so it was I had all these things of you want to find out what's the worst thing that could happen to them and put them in that position, and pushing it in these theoretical directions, but that I didn't have the handle on it at the time that you did. And so I think that it's a really important thing that the person who's on the project and has that deep understanding of it is the one who owns the choices of what feedback they take.
Yeah.
Cool. Front row.
Sure. Right, so as it's about building a design team, I thought I'd just talk about how, for anybody else who isn't at PikPok, how do you go about realizing you need a narrative design team, particularly with those comments you made earlier at the start, that there can be a lot of negativity in development to the idea of nobody reads story, et cetera, et cetera?
So question was, in case you didn't hear, how did we decide that we needed to build a narrative design team, even amongst that, some negativity or misunderstanding? That was kind of it. The more I had heard that, the more I went, okay, it was that advocacy. So we need someone in this discipline who is not just doing the work, but who is educating people on what that work is and why that work is important. And we got there both because, one, we had enough games with enough narrative content that it was clear that it was needed, and two, we did have some of these totally understandable and non-malicious misunderstandings. And the only way to fix that was to have someone who just lived in that world and it was only their job to advocate. And that's also what we hired for. And I was frank and said, look, you guys are going to have some challenges, but the good and bad news is you're not just going to be a writer. You are going to be like the champion of your discipline. And some days that's going to be amazing because you can help set how this department works. And some days that's going to suck because you're going to feel like you're banging your head against the wall. So we tried to be honest about that and let people know. There, and then there, and then there.
How much time is spent, like you talk about the grand fantasy that you're going to play for the whole title, how much time and what processes do you guys have to like kind of curate in this cross-disciplinary realms, like art and music? Do you guys spend a lot of time talking through that once you set up your own debuggles, or are you kind of like, let fly and I appreciate every creative piece that comes from it?
Nice. Yeah. Question is, how much time is spent cross-disciplinary making that, overall narrative design? And I think my answer will always be not enough. We try and do more and more, and we see the value, but there also comes a point where you have to make some decisions. So I think a win we've had is learning how valuable that is. For example, if you're making a tutorial, you can't just assign that to one discipline. A good tutorial or new user flow, it has to have good UX, it has to be frictionless and good flow. It has to have good UI, so you're clear that it's there. It has to have narrative design, so the story hooks are in and the character to voice. It has to have game design, because you need to know what you're teaching them about the mechanics and when and where you're trying to put them in the game. It has to have art. It has to have audio. And so I think we're starting to learn that. So it helps to, again, have that good teamwork and build that collaboration so you can go, look, we all add to this, let's all talk, and then hopefully we can come to some decisions about what we're going for and why, and then go away and do our other disciplines. That goes into a whole other talk, I think, about teamwork and facilitation. But I think to me, I think the best stuff comes when you get all those cross disciplines in a room talking and seeing where they can contribute, and that's even better than anyone's individual contributions.
Yeah.
You're the best hype man.
The rest of this talk is just us being like,
That's what I do for my birthday party too. I'm just gonna go to the bar. It's my birthday. Yeah.
it is.
Thank you again. Front row question.
My understanding is you see yourselves both narrative designers and game writers collectively. I was just wondering, where do you sort of see the boundaries of narrative design versus game writing? And do you ever feel the pressure to be both a great game designer and a great game writer?
Yeah, you guys are more in the trenches. What do you think?
Yeah, that's
Oh, sorry. The question was the balance between narrative design and game writing, and the pressure of trying to do both and where they overlap. And if you guys can all hear people talking and I'm just repeating for nothing, sorry.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's not one that I have a great answer for, other than it's challenging. I mean, you're kind of when you're in the narrative design space, you're thinking about the holistic player experience as they're going through, and sometimes dialogue isn't necessarily needed for that, even though it might be enjoyable to write that. So yeah, you kind of have to just think about how what you're writing is integrating into the game, and whether there are other ways of kind of delivering that information rather than characters and dialogue and things.
Yeah, I think it's hugely beneficial for the two roles to be with the same person, because a lot of the thinking that you're doing for the text that you're writing is thinking that you'd want to do as a narrative designer anyway. So if you're thinking about like plotting and characters and where dialogue should be taking place, and like how a long conversation impacts the pace versus a short conversation or no dialogue, those are kind of like narrative design questions, but they inform what text is written. So yeah, like going back to what Rick was saying, that a lot of the work is thinking and figuring stuff out and mapping things, mapping the story to how it can fit with the gameplay, and then where the text fits in. I think, I kind of see the narrative design as a step along the way to writing, and the text itself is only a component of our job, but it's a component that benefits from understanding the narrative design component.
Yeah, following on from what Stacey said, taking the time and sort of the narrative design mindset to really understand the tone that you need to be writing in. Because if you haven't taken that time and you're writing something that's very grim, dark, it's like, oh shit, this is a kid's game. That's not going to work. Same vice versa. So but most people wouldn't do that, because most people do most writers inherently understand tone. But I really appreciate that I can, as a narrative designer at PikPok, take the time to really go like, this is the tone of the game I'm working on. these are how the characters in this game talk. This is what the wider world is like. This is how we want the player to feel. And I can take all of that and put it into the script, and then I can iterate the script and go like, this should feel a lot more celebratory because this is like a warm game. We want them to feel like really cozy after.
We're going to cut you guys off so we can get last question at the mic, so we got 1 minute left.
Oh, sorry, Phil.
But good answers.
I was just wondering whether in your experience you've noticed any sort of teething issues if writers come from kind of a more conventional script writing background. Like you mentioned, Sarah, I think you kind of studied it, although, obviously this is what you wanted to do. And like following on from that, whether you had any sort of high level advice for someone who's coming from, say, film, theater, or television, like what are the kind of important things to focus on if you wanted to move into the kind of game writing / like narrative design space?
I don't think we did, because I think Mike and I very specifically hired for people who understood both. And that was one of the reasons we said no to some really talented film writers. And that's just what we needed, right? We might be at the point where we get that figured out and we just need some really talented writers. So if you don't have that experience, get it, do game jams, write interactive, twines or whatever. Just play games and be able to talk about them intelligently and analyze and deconstruct them.
Yeah, one of the questions in the interview was, what's a great example of narrative design and why? And there are people who, spend a lot of their time writing, but they actually struggle with that question or articulating why they liked certain games other than other ones, like the way the story was presented.
Because that character was really cool. What do you mean by that? How did the character interact with the world? Well, it was a cool character.
Shot a bunch of things and
I do have some advice there. If you don't do this already, DM a tabletop game for some friends. It teaches you a lot about storytelling. It teaches you a lot about game design and using your really good experience learned in script writing. You can use that to tell awesome stories for players. And what they bring to the table is, you have testers. You have people who are giving you immediate feedback on what you're putting out there, and it teaches you so much on the spot about, how to be a narrative designer.
Yeah, it's really relevant experience, and it's something we were looking for as well.
Yeah, like unlike the rest of these guys, I don't really have a film or script writing background, but to me it seems like the film stuff is kind of doing a lot of what games does. That, if your script, you're still thinking about visuals and you're still thinking about audio and you're still thinking about lots of different components and how they can come together to create the experience. And it's just that games adds the new dimension of interactivity. So I guess I would like lean into that like multi-disciplinary bend that filmmaking already has, and then really try to sort of think about what interactivity and choice, if that changes the structures and the way that you approach it.
That's our time. Find us after the talk, after the con, after the party. Thank you.